Welcome to Disrupt Ed. This week it is me finally back after a couple of weeks off, Steve Mouldey. Claire is currently stuck in Italy trying to avoid the coronavirus. She had arrived up there for a conference which was cancelled as she arrived. She's flying back in this weekend, so she'll be back next week. But I am really lucky to be joined here this evening, by Professor Peter O'Connor. So welcome, Peter.
Oh, kia ora, Steve. Lovely to be here. And it's hot.
It is.
It's like Auckland's baking.
So for those, many of the people in our DisruptED group do tend to know about the Creative Thinking Project, but for those that perhaps haven't come across the Creative Thinking Project, could you give a little bit of an introduction?
Yeah, sure. It's a project that runs out of the University of Auckland. I'm a professor up there in the Faculty of Education and Social Work. Started about 5 or 6 years ago, and its primary driver was to highlight and shape a national conversation about the central importance of creativity in everyday life. And we've done that through bringing out some of the world's leaders in creative thinking, from neuroscience to people who've been creating theatre in prisons through to arts educators. So that's been part of the work. We've been engaged in some really significant research, which I'm sure we'll talk about coming up. And so that's the work that we've been doing now for nearly 5 years. We've been really lucky. We had some really significant philanthropic support by the Chartwell Trust, by the Christy Fernyhough Trust, and that's enabled us to do some pretty exciting cutting-edge research.
And we've met a couple of times, and we've had a few interactions and things, so I know quite a bit about a few of the projects, but one of the projects that I'm absolutely fascinated by, and I know there's some really great events coming up from that, or some products coming up from that, is your work in Skid Row.
Yeah, so about this time last year, I directed a theatre performance by the Hobson Street Theatre Company, which is New Zealand's only theatre company by, for and with people who've experienced or are living or are homeless. That won a number of international awards, and I got this invitation from an LA movie producer to go and work in Skid Row. Skid Row is in the heart of Los Angeles. Over 5,000 people are homeless in a very small area, many of them in tents. And one of the extraordinary things, and it's also true of homeless people here in New Zealand who sleep in garages or cars or on the street, they get up in the morning and go to work, send their kids to school. That the homelessness crisis in the United States is at such an epidemic proportion, and large amounts of that are on the West Coast, that everyday life exists in ways which are hard to imagine. When I went up this last time, I went with a friend of mine. He said, when you walk into Skid Row, you walk past the Lamborghinis and the incredible wealth of the United States into a place which is hard to imagine, like you're walking into a video game. So I got to work at the Museum of Contemporary Art for 5 days with 25 residents of Skid Row who are also artists. So they belong to an extraordinary theatre company called Los Angeles Poverty Department, Urban Voices, which must be the coolest choir that's ever walked the planet. Beautiful, beautiful voices, ways of being in the world. We worked with a mosaic art company, and what we did is we created a show in 4 days that we put on in the Museum of Contemporary Art, and it told the story of two things. One of the things that I found out and discovered about Skid Row is it's held together by two things. It's held together by death. Over 1,000 people a year die on Skid Row. So one of the things that surrounds everything that happens in Skid Row is sort of the crisis and the grief of that. And the work that we did actually looked at that. But the other glue on Skid Row that keeps people alive is creativity in the arts. So these people that I work with, on Skid Row there's over 600 artists who identify as artists who are working in a whole range of different ways. That you need food, shelter, and a whole bunch of things to stay alive. But the arts, they keep your soul alive. Creativity keeps the spark going. And I certainly saw that, witnessed that. We've just finished a short documentary on that work, which reveals really the capacity for the arts to heal.
And I'm fascinated because there are stories around about, sort of artists when you go back centuries ago that were living in poverty, yet they're some of the people known as the greatest artists of the time. What's the link in there?
Well, the arts help us to make meaning and sense of the world. They're tools by which to do that. And when you are in crisis, it's often the need to express, and not purely to express, but the arts are a way of thinking about the world. I often talk about with my students at the university, in Terezin concentration camp, there were over 12,000 children, Jewish children, who were exterminated in that camp. But one of the things that survives the camp is the extraordinary art that they made. When you look at the art that they made, it's striking in its beauty, in its celebration of life, its reclaiming of joy and purpose in the darkest of places, a concentration camp for 8 and 9-year-old children. That art and the music that was made, the extraordinarily beautiful orchestra that performed in the concentration camps, it's a deep, my understanding of it is the need to make art is central to who we are as humans. It's one of the first things we do is make a mark on a piece of paper. We don't
and
walk.
Quickly turn and show it to someone.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually, that audience thing is really important. I've got a 14-month-old granddaughter, and she spends her whole life from the moment she wakes, the moment she goes to sleep, learning. It's her job. She does it extraordinarily well, which we all did. And she does it through her senses, through her dancing. Watching her play with sound, with words, is just amazing. And the joy that it gives her and the joy that it gives us as her whānau, and seeing how she's grappling with the world, and she's grappling with the world already through the arts, through the senses. And of course we know in schools that's an unusual thing.
Yeah, I mean I'm in a privileged position at the moment, being in a really creative
absolutely
little,
you are. Yeah.
Little school.
Yeah.
But with my office being right in the middle, I'm constantly getting kids coming in to show me this is the latest thing I've created. Like really wanting to share what they've done. And and there's a couple of little ones who actually really struggle in some terms, like literacy and some of those other basics. But get them with some Lego, get them with some art, and they're constantly asking, "Can I bring this? Can I take this home? Can I take this home and show my parents? I want to show them what I've created, what I've done."
I'm not a great, and music teachers tell me off for this. Other than the recorder, there's nothing more joyful than kids coming home and bringing their artwork. You know, the painful. You know, I can remember, you know, suggesting to my daughter she went and practiced at the end of the garden. But having said that, you know, the importance of the arts as meaning makers, as a way in which we not just express what we know about the world, but also use it as a way to come to know about the world, is really important. But there's also this amazing capacity for the arts to celebrate being alive. There's nothing more joyful than music, and nothing more painful than music. You know, and I'm not talking about the recorder. You know, the capacity for the arts to make us.
We can call the recorder painful. I'm with you.
But we you know, and I get into trouble now. But the capacity for the arts to celebrate life, to mark life, to memorialise, to do all. Nothing else. Numbers can't do that. You can tally up numbers, but the bit that makes your soul burst, either with tears or joy or whatever, it's the arts. And you know, the great tragedy really in New Zealand schools is that it's been hammered to death by an education system that really doesn't care about it.
So let's go there. We were talking earlier before we came online about the 1950s and Beebe and Gordon Tovey that he put in place, basically with that aim of developing arts education and creativity in schools.
Yeah.
You know, and so there's been changes over decades there. What have we lost? What's going on?
You know, we've lost an enormous amount, and I've written about this and talked about it at length now. Beebe and Tovey understood the central importance of the arts in protecting democracy. That if you want a vibrant democracy, you need critical, creative citizens. And that the way, you know, it goes back before Tovey, all the way back to John Dewey, who said you make democracy with your hands. It's a practical kind of a thing. And of course, Dewey was writing about the link between the arts and democracy and education well over 100 years ago. But we live in a time of not too different from the 40s and the 50s. Tovey and Beebe were interested in the arts because, you know, as a response to Stalinism and Nazism and extremism, and how do you get young people not just to answer questions, but to question answers? How do you get them to be creative and imaginative? How do you get them to not just prepare for work, but to imagine new work? How do you get them to not just prepare for the future, but actually shape the future? It's the arts. And we've had, you know, a grinding focus on literacy and numeracy for so long in this country. It was even before national standards. But national standards just kind of killed the arts dead in primary schools, just wiped them off the planet. And the danger of that is, you know, and I don't think it's an over-amplification. It's a threat to democracy. It kills joy in classrooms. It kills joy in teaching. It reduces teaching to a tick box mentality where you're being checked on whether or not they've moved some bloody line somewhere and what some stupid outcome somewhere, rather than this notion that you might make something incredibly beautiful with kids and give them the joy of that.
So how do we marry that up with the fact that, you know, internationally, people look at our, I mean, it's still called the new curriculum. It's been 13 years, 2007 curriculum.
Yeah.
You know, internationally, they look at that curriculum and they say, wow, look at the freedom you've got there. Look at the power that you've got there. How do we marry up what's happened with the arts with this actually quite empowering curriculum document?
Yeah, it's great question, Steve. One that I kind of not lose sleep over. Nothing's worth that. But you know, the reality is that the New Zealand curriculum doesn't drive what happens in schools. What drove schools in primary schools in particular was national standards, literacy and numeracy. And the great tragedy for me is that technically we might have got rid of national standards, but practically they're still there. This accumulation of data to prove something still sits, and teachers are still justifying everything they do around that. That one of the great failures of this government has been they picked the low-lying fruit, which was to repeal national standards, but they've done nothing to shift what might be in its place. And in fact, what worries me sometimes, the way they talk, and the way they're thinking about NCA is more exam-focused, a whole bunch of things. There was reports yesterday about how they're collapsing in the science curriculum, narrowing, that's kind of its focus. So the only thing I would say is that none of this happened by accident. This is deliberate government policy stretching back a long time. It's part of international government policy. And you could argue it's actually about making sure we create a workforce who can follow instructions rather than either question them or answer them. And that's about creating low-wage economies. It's about driving a particular agenda, which is a direct threat to democracy. Trump doesn't want people to be able to think. Neither does Boris Johnson. And
yet we live in a time where there's never been more talk about all these lines of the jobs of the future that aren't created today. You get all these TED Talks that are watched and clicked and shared. Ken Robinson with the most watched TED Talk ever. All these sides of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we talk about this at education conferences all the time, and whenever teachers get together, this is one of the types of conversations that go on. Yeah. So how do we actually get that shift happening? Because,
Well, one of the things which has been really interesting for me is how do you play the game back? And so what we've created at the university is Creative Schools Index. So we've been collecting large data on the state of the creative environment in New Zealand schools and linking that across to student achievement, linking it across to student engagement and motivation, and also kind of demystifying what it means to have a creative school or to have a creative classroom. People kind of have this notion, or some people want to dismiss being creative and arts by thinking it's got something to do with floating around the place and expressing yourself. Anyone who's ever played a musical instrument will tell you that it's the most disciplined. Being creative, being an artist requires extraordinary inner discipline. And, so it's not an either or in classrooms. But the data that we're pulling together, so I'm heading up to Belgium to meet in the European Commission, because what they're interested in, I've been told, and why I've been invited up to speak at the Commission, is how do you make schools more creative? Because the kind of skills exactly that you were talking about, those soft skills, how do you learn to collaborate, take risks, work not in disciplinary silos but across disciplines? How do you synthesize new ideas, pull them together? How do you do all those kinds of things, and what employers are saying they need for the 21st century? So you've got that, and what we've got is a tool which says we can help teachers understand how to bring that into a school, how to measure it, and then begin to measure the kind of difference that they're making.
And that measurement thing is an interesting bit, right? Because everyone always talks about that you value what you measure, and you measure what you value. So so many more schools now talking this is creativity, like this is something we really value, but actually then all their measurements are still on those on the literacy and numeracy. So how is it that you can measure something like creativity?
So there are lots of for nearly 60 years in terms of psychometric testing, you can there are the Torrance test and a range of others which test an individual's capacity to be creative. But you can look, especially in a school environment, look at a series of what we've named the 11 different dimensions of a creative environment, so that we know, for example, that a creative environment encourages kids to be curious. And we know, and so when you start to unpack what that means, do kids want to find out things for an intrinsic reason, in and of itself, rather than the merit that's attached? And what kind of pedagogy encourages and rewards curiosity? We know what kills it, but we also know what does it. We know that if we encourage kids to intrinsically seek out for the sake of knowing, like my granddaughter does, it's not because we're going to give her a reward for it. The reward is in the knowing. That if you have schools that have those kinds of approaches, you make a difference. Risk-taking. One of the things about national standards in a heavy testing environment is that kids don't take risks with their learning. What they're always seeking is the one right, correct. We've been talking about this for so long, but you can break it down and you can look at the kinds of ways in which teachers ask questions, how they get kids to ask questions, how those kinds of processes happen in classrooms. So we administer a 64 item scale, which provides a selfie to schools and says, you know what, in terms of how your students think you're doing in terms of providing an environment where they can take risks, you're doing a great job, or you're not doing a great job, and the reason why you're not doing a great job is you're not doing these things.
So, I mean, some of the factors may go across both, but how many of those factors would be, kind of needing school leadership on board, and how many of them, because a lot of the things that you're talking about, to me, can be done in a classroom by a teacher. Yeah,
and it's, I've always been a great believer in teachers as professionals who make professional choices and decisions, and how they do that in classrooms to meet the needs and aspirations and dreams of their students. But some of it is around nothing changes in schools if you haven't got principal buy-in or senior leader buy-in. We know that.
Yeah, and I mean, I can vividly remember a lesson that I was doing at a school. I was doing a guerrilla geography lesson, so as a geographer and social science teacher, we'd been talking about some elements of geography and some of the geographic concepts. And so I sent them out around the school with chalk to actually emphasise where they could see some of those concepts in action.
Yeah.
And next minute, around the corner comes the DP, yelling at the kids, and all of a sudden I'm having to
deal with all that. Yeah.
This is a lesson. They're doing this. This is.
Yeah, if you dig deeply into Ken Robinson's, if we designed a system to kill creativity, we couldn't design any better than we have. So that's around, and there's a lot of things which contribute to that. There are structural constraints, and we've built a system where, and the previous government talked about it all the time. The primary purpose of education was to train, was for the workforce, and it was always about preparation for the future. So there was nothing in schools which was much to do with explaining the world as it is and how it might be different. And we've got structures where we, large numbers of kids through buildings which aren't built to purpose, that don't kind of reflect who and where we are. Even the new ones. I've been out to some of the modern learning environments. Schools were built as factories in the 1800s, and we built modern learning environments, and they just look like 21st century factories.
Big, massive shells.
Yeah, it's the same bloody thing. It's just kind of like, we just need a factory, and what we'll do is we'll make it 21st century, so we'll just build another factory. So those kinds of things.
And make it colourful.
And make it, and then somehow it's more creative because someone's put some paint around, or they've got funky chairs. One of the, that doesn't make a creative environment. But some of the kind, so what we do is we go into a school, we administer the survey, and then we have long conversations with senior leadership teams, teachers, and schools. And some of the kinds of things that we say, well, look, we can't shift those because they're built into the system. Year 13 kids take less risks in their learning because because this is about how they're going to get into whatever career they want to get into. So there's that, but that doesn't mean that your pedagogy has to be so narrow and tight that that's all it is. But that's a constraint that you can't shift, and you recognise that. I was actually with the principal of a school the other day, and we looked at all the 11 dimensions, and she said, you know what, I think the thing we can really look at is our physical environment, because clearly our kids are saying the physical space in which they are learning is not conducive to being creative. And one of the aspects that we look at, you need to collaborate often.
Absolutely. Creativity
is really important. But the other thing about creativity is you need a place to reflect and be quiet and to do stuff on your own. And one of the great problems of MLEs is it's bloody hard to find somewhere quiet to do the kind of, so flexible learning spaces are really important. They're far more important than how much colour you've got and how funky the place looks. That's really useful, but you need to have spaces where different kinds of learning are possible because of the different kinds of spaces. I teach at the University of Auckland, and I run a course on the creative process, and every now and again I end up running tutorials in places where furniture's bolted to the floor in a rate setting with 45 young people, and you're trying to get them to talk to each other, and you just go, well, actually, the pedagogy is so stuffed by the physical environment. So I have to work around that. Not always successfully, but it's part of the constraints of schools.
But constraints can also cause creativity at times.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
that's one of my favourite things. So when I was studying for my master's while teaching, I read a lot into complexity theory, and so that got me right into that whole thing.
Have you recovered?
I went down a wormhole, and actually a good friend of mine who I was teaching with a few years ago, she started to come across this idea of complexity theory, and she came to me and she said, now I've heard you use this before, and I said, well, hang on, this is almost like the Matrix here. You need to decide if you're ready to take that pill and go into
just
it,
keep diving,
because once you're in there, you're never going to unsee it.
Yeah, I think one of the fascinating things for me, I used to be an English teacher. About the worst thing you can say to a kid is go and write a poem. But say to a kid, you write a 14-line sonnet that's iambic pentameter with and it's rhyming couplets A, B, and so forth. You do it like that. The structure and the constraint gives the freedom and the possibility to create. This notion that being creative in class is kids swinging around and doing whatever the hell they like has been, I think, part of the difficulty that we've had convincing people that creative is important. The other bugger for me, to be honest with you, is that arts teachers, arts leaders, creative people don't end up in the Ministry of Education. They don't tend to end up being principals because they don't. That's not, being driven by bureaucracy or driving bureaucracy. Whenever I see great creative arts people go into bureaucracy, and I go, oh damn, we've lost one, and then I go, oh no, fantastic, we've got an enemy within who can kind of shift and change it. The worm inside the apple is a far more important, and that's been part of our problem. And the other part of the problem is we haven't told our story well. So one of the things about the Creative Index for me is, it's really important to tell the importance of the arts in Skid Row and what happens in schools and all the rest of it. But the story of the data, that, Hattie, John Hattie, it's had an enormous impact on what's happened in schools. I'm not making any comment as to whether it was for the better or for the worse, but part of that was because of the scale and the size of the data and the way in which he was able to manipulate that and tell a particular story It's not a story I agree with, but it's a story that was deeply persuasive because of the sheer numbers and the way in which you could talk and use those in a way that convinced policymakers. And the arts have never done that. And what we're attempting to do is to do that with the index.
So there are obviously, I'd like to say there's a few of us trying to make those changes in school leadership.
Yeah, there sure is. Yeah, great people.
How do we go about convincing more of the school leaders and more of the bureaucracy to do this? Is it through like parents and the general community? How do we go about this?
Well, one of the things that we have done is to establish what we did at the university was to call together for the first time in over a decade all the leaders of the different subject associations in the arts to come together and to be a really strong advocacy and voice for the arts, for creativity within schools. You know, one of the sad things I think is that, you know, we have a Prime Minister for the arts, and I guess that we still have this really scattergun approach. We don't have a strategy for how you might use the arts after disaster, and yet we know it's really important. How do we use the arts in prison? How do we use the arts in schools? Why should we? How do we do that? How do we know if what we're doing is really good and it's just kind of business as usual? And you know, I've pushed and advocated and done all that, and I think the thing that I get, and I get invited to speak all over the country and to do talks like this tonight, there's an enormous hunger that the Ministry of Education doesn't get and doesn't understand and almost, I think, doesn't want to know, from teachers who want to make teaching creative and joyful. Teachers are over ticking meaningless boxes. It's just soul destroying. I meet so many teachers who say, older teachers who say, I remember when we used to do.
Yeah.
You know, why can't we do that anymore? And I go, what's stopping you? And the tragedy is our so many tragedies when you talk about the arts and creativity in school. But I almost think our least experienced teachers in New Zealand are our least creative. Because in their initial teacher education, they got none of what we're talking about here. They wouldn't even know this existed.
So I've had, I've got a couple of friends who, now that their kids are older, they've gone back to retrain to be teachers. You know, they've been mums, so they've sort of been part-time working while the kids were young, and they've actually gone back to retrain as being teachers. And they had their first placement of school, you know, in a school, and they came back and just went, "You've got to be kidding me!" And you know, and some of these were parents that have been parents at Play Centre, and so they'd seen all these really great creative things. And thankfully, what they've got is a group of about 7 or 8 of them in the same course together. And so they got together and they flicked us a message and said, "Can we come and visit you? We need to come and see some of this." And you know, and it was fascinating talking to them as they came out, that there was this group of them who have been trying to talk to the people in charge of their course, you know, about what it is that they wanted to do, and you know, and thankfully they've been allowed to actually come and visit some of the places like us for these short little things where it's like
bursts of possibility.
Go and visit a school for an hour and a half and observe this. But they're not interested in even engaging. I said, "Look, I'm happy to come and talk to your course or do this," and they're not interested. They're like, "No, we've got our little set thing that we're doing."
Yep, you know, one of the Taika Waititi's Oscar-winning speech was extraordinary, beautiful in so many ways, and you know, he talked about the importance of Indigenous children having the opportunity to tell their stories through their arts, and we don't provide that for them in our schools. It's you know, an extraordinary exception. People like him. All our children have stories to tell, and they have a right. You know, it's in the it's a human right that they have access. can do that with their lives and in their lives, and that that we have deliberately excluded the arts from schools is a shocking thing.
And we currently have a government that, you know, unleashed its wellbeing budget a couple of years ago.
Yep.
That you know, calls themselves champions of you know, of cultural sustainability and those sides of things. Yet here's one way with, you know, by putting a real emphasis on creativity and education,
you know,
could be helping both of these.
Absolutely. The living in a place where it's really hard to give full expression of who you are, which is what creativity and the art's about, is really hard for your well-being. The reality is, for many, many children, schools are not good for their wellness. And I think that's an enormously important, you know, that the importance of the arts and a creative environment where it's okay to get things wrong, to take risks, to be playful. You know, one of the questions that we ask in the survey is ask kids about being playful. And we ask them how often they laugh in schools. It's deeply, deeply fascinating, the responses we get. The longer you spend at school, the less you laugh. It's one of, you know, it's probably true actually of life. The longer you live, the less you laugh. I try and laugh all the time because it's great for you. It's great for, I mean, there's nothing better for your life than to laugh. You know, and again, I watch my 14-month-old granddaughter laughs constantly because life is fun.
And that aligns with all the research that's been done around how many questions a day people ask.
Oh, that's extraordinary research,
you know,
isn't it?
We're 4-year-olds. It's, you know, this massive number, and we've all experienced that.
Yeah.
And then as you go, by the time you're 16, it's plummeted.
It's not, you know, Ken Robinson's "We Kill Creativity." You know, we kill joy. Teachers don't want to do that. They exist in a system that does that. Elliot Eisner, who was a great arts thinker, arts educator, said there are multiple kinds of curriculum. There's the formal curriculum. There's the hidden curriculum. But he also talked about the null curriculum, the things that we don't have. So when we don't have the arts, when we don't have history, when we don't have those things in schools, it's not by accident. We didn't teach New Zealand history, and we didn't teach it for generations, not by accident. It's something that
intentional.
It was intentional. And to kid ourselves otherwise, you know, is a lie. We don't have the arts, we don't have creativity, not because it's an accident, it's because it's deliberate. It's a policy. It's being driven by policy. So
in primary schools, there's a lot of scope for teachers to bring art into their everyday with what they're doing in different areas. And I think that's quite obvious to most teachers.
Yeah. And they find hard to get it in.
What about secondary school? Where so you end up with, you know, where most secondary schools are set up with a system where you go to one teacher for this and one teacher for this and one teacher for this.
I mean, well, it's the ultimate in factory model, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, you know, one part of the conveyor belt does one thing, and then another bit gets added, and another gets added, and then at the end of the conveyor belt, you're either a reject or you're ready to be sold onto the market. A reasonably accurate description of our system.
Sounds good.
So my sense around that is it is more difficult, but the joy of, you know, you can be a hell of a creative maths teacher when you allow kids to take risks, when you provide them the opportunity to kind of go, I learned this here and I learned this from over here, and I can put those two things together. You can be enormously creative in science. The scientific method is creativity in action. You know, there's nothing more creative than the scientific method. I wonder what this is. Oh, I know what. I'll find out whether or not that works. And, oh, here's another answer.
And
Oh,
so
that's
and
enormous.
this has been my passion for years, and the thing that I've always gone on to conferences and tried to spread to other teachers. All those little activities
Yeah.
that can start to make a real difference in your class, to actually show students we're okay to make risk, to take risks, even down to like the little 1 minute challenges. Here's a couple of pipe cleaners. Make a piece of jewellery
Great.
for your partner, or
Go ahead now, go.
and you got 1 minute, and little activities
And
like
doing
that.
something with your hands. One of the things which happens in schools is that the longer you're at school, the more still you become.
Mm-hmm.
And everything, by the time you get to university, everything's kind of filtered pretty much just through one part of your body. The whole notion that you might learn through your body is almost gone by the time you get to year 13, and in fact even younger. And and you saw you actually, there's this bizarre stuff happening in early childhood education where kids are filling in those activity sheets, and you just kind of go, what the hell is going on? These kids should be running, playing, doing a whole bunch of things and exploring the world, and doing that with an adult.
Well, and yet, is it Oxford that has the Philosopher's Walk? Like this was a place when they were stuck in their offices or their lecture theatres, they would go for the walk.
Go for
that
the
would
walk,
help
and the importance. Lots of neuroscience work around the longer you sit, the less you learn.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really simple. If your kids are sitting there all day, guess what? They're not learning as much as
that whole embodied cognition.
that
stuff
whole
of
embodied
actually
cognition
we
stuff.
need to do things in our in our
and
classes.
we know that. Part of the thing that kind of drives me nuts in this whole debate that we're having now, and the debates that I seem to endlessly be in about the importance of creativity, it's not like the research doesn't prove what we know.
Yeah.
We know arts-rich creative schools, kids do better at literacy and numeracy. And we've invested millions and millions and God knows how much money and time and energy and sweat and tears into literacy and numeracy strategies that don't mention the arts. And yet the research is crystal clear. It's not literacy and numeracy or the arts and creativity. It's about how they work together. You see, that's synthesis. That's about how you bring those ideas together, and you might.
And that's also the whole person and all those sort of things that are going to create the citizens that are going to go in.
Yeah.
And be able to change things.
And, we've been doing the same old garbage for years in education. Another literacy strategy, another way of measuring this. Let's do this, let's do that. Let's go from outcomes to thresholds. Let's do God knows what else. It's just a how you repaint the deck chairs on the Titanic. And the arts and creativity to going, we've got multiple studies across Europe, across Asia, we've got multiple studies across Australia, multiple studies here now in New Zealand, and you can't get the policy people to even engage in the conversation.
Okay, so ideal world, and all of a sudden, Professor Peter O'Connor has been appointed Director of Education.
Yeah.
What's the first steps? What's the priorities?
The priority for me is about how do you return humanity and joy and life into factories, and how do you do that in a way which empowers. Every teacher I've ever spoken to went into teaching because they loved the idea that they could make a really positive difference in the life of young people. Yeah. I haven't met a teacher I literally haven't met a teacher who wasn't driven by that. I've seen so many of them driven out because they don't get a chance to do that. One of the great hopes I had with this government, which has been dashed, was that the revolution that they said they were going to make changes as big as BB. And they didn't. Part of the problem
There's been a lot of talk over the last 3 years.
Oh, I know. There's been. Here's the thing. I think there was There were 27 reviews of education committees up and down the country. Not one single arts person on it. Not one. Welby, I think, was a guardian, but I don't know what's happened to the guardian angels. I think they've fallen off somewhere. They've disappeared somewhere. I don't know where they went.
One report came out and then they were sidelined.
But when you look right across, there's no arts thinking. There's no thinking about that. It's kind of like, how do we retread what we know has failed? It's extraordinary. And it's not about tinkering.
No,
we're past tinkering.
Well, and I mean, my entire career until a year ago had been in the public system, and I was at the point where I'd been part of a school that had really tried to push the boundaries and things when we started up. I went into a different school trying to help to bring about change in an existing school, and I just realised this is going to take decades to get the changes through that actually need to be done pretty much now. And that's why I jumped to where I am now in the private sector, where we could go, actually, we're not tinkering, we're going to actually reimagine this and we're going to change things up. But, our whole philosophy is that we're going to help, that we're going to do this on a small basis, because actually it's those deeper relationships that allow us to do a lot more. It's about how we make that impact across the country.
Yep, it is. If I was the Director General, I'd pull us out of PISA for a start. Don't buy into the bullshit, and just say, actually, measuring and determining our policy based on that is not what you do. I'd get rid of ASTEL. I'd get rid of an enormous plethora. My wife taught in South Auckland for a number of years, and she said, I barely got the chance to teach. I spent most of the time measuring what the hell they were doing. For some report somewhere that justified something that kind of meant that you could work out whether or not they were a standard kid or not. It's destructive for the profession of teaching. It sucks the joy, the life out of classrooms. So, there are... And what have they done? They've decided that what they need in NCA is more exams.
It was horrifying.
I just didn't... It was just like... at that point, I think I gave up. I just thought, okay, I don't know who you're talking to. But, well, I do know who you're talking to. You're talking to some very conservative voices in our education system who seem to run the roost. Run the roost? Is that a... Rule the roost?
Rule the roost might be
roost
better,
the rule? One of those things?
You've created a new saying. So then for those of us that are most likely to never be Director of Education...
Exactly. I think that's both of us.
Because we say a bit too much and
could be.
Things like that. But for those of us and those that watch this or listen to this, the things that they can go about doing straight away, those small things. What's the best advice that you've got for people in that position?
I think there's nothing more rewarding or refreshing than being fully human in a classroom, which means I'm going to take some risks with my teaching. I'm not doing the same old stuff day after day, year after year. I'm not going to be driven by external demands which aren't actually necessary or important for the group of young people that's in front of my classroom. I'm going to be the professional who says, this is my room, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it, in a responsible, professional manner, but making those kinds of choices and decisions. Be playful. And being playful means being playful with ideas.
Yeah.
Accept what comes at you from kids and move from there.
I'm actually going to grab this book at this stage. So a couple of teachers in the US that I actually first connected with through some design thinking chats online. And they created this, and they used the term rigorous whimsy.
Oh, exactly.
And it's
great.
And this is...
I'm going to use it now myself. It'll be my lecture next week.
They're both English teachers, and a lot of it is playing with words and all this side of things, and it's just beautiful. Now, I used this originally as a social studies teacher, and then since I've been in senior leadership, I've often said to teachers, take this away and have a flick through. There's so many little activities. I can remember greenish book that came out sometime in the late 80s, Top Tools for Social Science Teachers.
Yes, I know the book.
That, and that was where I got introduced to things like Scamper and, like some of those basic strategies to use in the classroom.
Yeah.
Well, this is like that, but actually takes it and adds in the play. Adds in the play.
Play is at the heart of all learning. It's at the heart of everything. A playful classroom does not mean letting kids run amok. It's that rigorous whimsy.
Yeah.
I most of my life teaching drama, right? I remember doing but just as a quick story, doing this work with kids, and I played the role of someone who was sad. I was working actually with a group of kids in a special needs unit, and so I'm sitting there on the ground, and I said, I'm really sad, and could they help me? And they were really quite intent on helping me. And one little boy said, you'll need some happy pills, some happiness pills. So I immediately accepted it. The teacher went, don't be silly, Stephen. He doesn't need happiness pills, because he imagined that there was a right answer to that. Rigorous whimsy, to use your term, I went, where would I find that? Well, you could go to a happiness shop. So we made a happiness shop. And what was really interesting, they asked me a whole range of questions, and it became a maths lesson in the end. They worked out whether or not I needed a quarter, a half, or a full pill. And for them, happiness pills weren't about, they weren't talking antidepressants. But it was a solution. And what really struck me was the response by the teacher, which was, don't be silly, Stephen. Yeah. We'd actually met the sad person on the street after having been in a magical bus that had flown through the air. It's kind of like, actually, I was hoping that they might be silly about that kind of thing and arrive at somewhere. In the old days, this is going, in the old days, we used to talk about the teaching moment. A teaching moment for me is always, a kid gives you something, I always accept it. It's part of actually our
an improv thing, isn't it?
It's an improv. It's a yes and.
Yeah.
So when someone offers you something, rather than going, oh, that's not the right answer.
Yes and.
It's yes and. It's a simple thing for life. It's a simple thing for teaching. You ask a question, an answer comes back, rather than kind of like, that's the wrong answer. It's like, yes, and what if that was the answer? Those kinds of
from
things.
my experience in teaching, taking the risks and being playful like that has always it's always paid off, but it's also been easier if I've had someone else to bounce it off. So like in terms of either someone that I share an office with that would provoke me, or if I didn't have that person there, it was online communities or different things, and I've always found that has been something that's really helped me. So I guess my advice to teachers that are trying to get more playful in the classroom is actually connect with someone who you can bounce those ideas with.
Look, and the other thing around it is that, and I find it's this risk-taking thing which is so important. If you want to be a creative teacher, you're going to have to do things that don't work. And you know what? Kids forgive you.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they're used to crap lessons.
So that's what they live most of their day.
So you do something that doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. It's actually really important. I remember...
But then you can also be totally surprised. So I'm now thinking of a lesson that I did when I was at Hobsonville Point, and I was working with a science teacher, and we were working away, and we were looking at the ideas of colonisation. And so social science perspective.
Great.
And we're looking at that. And so we actually came up with the idea of, right, we're going to split the class in half. Half of them live on an alien planet. Half of them are going to come in and colonise. And without any prompting from us, they ended up creating a treaty. There were massive...
Did they break the treaty, or did they keep it?
They broke the treaty.
Fascinating.
They had some real cultural misunderstandings and battles over resources that were actually treasures.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, out of this, we sat there, and so we gathered everyone together afterwards, and we really went through, okay, so what was it like for your group when this happened? Talked the whole way through, and after they all left, we just sat there stunned and looked at each other and went, could we have had a better context to now bring in the Treaty of Waitangi?
No, and it is about taking that risk. It could have all fallen over, but actually, to keep the joy of teaching, and I'm still in and out of classrooms up and down the country, and I teach obviously at the university, and I love it. I can't think of a better job. I mean, I'm so lucky, blessed to have been a teacher. But to keep the joy and the love of it alive, you have to be creative. If you're not, it kills you. It's what, it's as simple as that, really. Stay alive.
Right, well, I think we're probably getting towards the end of our time. We've definitely got into our passion area and kept on going. We could keep this going.
My God,
forever. So thank you very much for coming on. I always love talking with you because I have actually a really shared passion around this creativity in schools.
We really do, yeah.
The Creative Schools Index, is there a way for other schools in future to get in contact with this?
Yeah, people have been listening to the show or whatever, and they want to, they can contact me at the University of Auckland. If you do a Google search, you'll find me. Yep. Usually find me attacking the education systems or being attacked for attacking education systems. So one of those two things, but you'll find me at the university. Yep.
Brilliant. All right. Once again, thank you very much. I have seen Claire has popped up on the feed, so obviously she's woken up very early in Italy. We'll give you a little wave there,
Hi,
Claire, and hope you are finding some creative ways to spend your time while you wait for your flight back from Italy.
Yep.
And I'm sure if you all leave comments on the DisruptEd page as to what she should do creatively while she's waiting, I'm sure we can come up with things. Great. Some of the second-hand clothes shopping, what can you turn that into?
Cinzano is quite good. Martini, I think, is from Italy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, once again, thank you very much, and see you all next week.
Magic.
Thank you so much.